Just before we do start taking the first questions, just to say that these talks are all organised by volunteers who are interested in movements to change society. The series of talks is going to continue into May next year, and there are some expenses, room bookings, some fares to pay, and for publicity. So if anyone is able to make a contribution to costs, there will be a box or some kind of receptacle which will be passed around during the discussion. So if you are able to contribute, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll take questions first of all, and we might move into more of a discussion format later depending on how things are going. Has anyone got any questions that they would like to ask Liz? I'm going to take a few. I'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Okay, Andy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you were talking about the strike committee. So, I mean, what was the strike committee? How was it created? And in particular, the question I'd like to ask is how separate was it from the union, or was it just the low-level union people who in fact constituted the strike committee? Was it just a shop steward meeting effectively?
Liz, the strike it reminds me of a little bit is the Pilkington's dispute, and I'm interested in whether there are any direct connections between the two. So, for example, one similarity which is quite striking is he said, as far as I can tell, in the Pilkington's dispute in St Helens, which took place a couple of months afterwards, it's a kind of very similar situation, very right-wing, very unpleasant trade union, unofficial action. There was, as far as you can tell, there were thousands of workers involved, but there wasn't a single revolutionary socialist who was working in any of the factories in St Helens where the strikes took place. And the only direct influence from any far leftists was apparently a Communist Party building worker. You mentioned these two guys, what was it, the Roaches?
Yeah.
And you said they were socialists. So I just
Yeah.
wondered what sort of socialists. Is it true that it was just a kind of, it was a barren land for the revolutionary left? I must say, I mean, I was a kid when this strike took place, but I was brought up in Leeds, and it was indescribably grim. And you can kind of get a bit of a feeling for it there. I mean, I'm wondering what other agitation was going on in Leeds at the time. I mean, I was a kid, I wasn't paying attention. Is it connected to anything else? And my final question I wondered was, in St Helens, in the Pilkington dispute, it kind of led to rather an unfortunate situation with an attempt at a union breakaway, which failed, and was rather a mess, actually. And I'm wondering what medium-term impact the strike had on the union here. Thanks.
There's quite a lot to go on, so I'll come back to you, Marco.
Okay. The strike committee, certainly in the bigger factories, they were elected. They were not necessarily shop stewards. In fact, in the film, and this is based on the Communist Party shop steward who, in the film, turns rather bad. But he wouldn't be on the strike committee, and he was a convener. So I think there were some stewards, but also people who could just say, I want to be on the strike committee. And they would be elected from the different factories. Probably not from the sweatshops like we just saw there, but from the bigger factories. And some of the factories, like Burton's, was thousands of people, so they were very big. And I think, again, except for the connections between some of the stewards and the union, of course, would have been quite strong. But I think the strike committee generally was pretty militant and very much in touch with the members, the workers. And there were these regular mass meetings, as I say, a thing of the past, but thousands of people coming together. There's one wonderful bit of the film which I was going to show, but it's a bit long, which is the meeting in the Leeds Town Hall, which Roy Battersby talks about, and I quoted, he talked about that, where the union officials are on the platform, and they're saying, you've got to go back to work, we don't have any money, we can't afford this strike. and what had happened and really happened. And the strikers all started throwing money at the union officials. It's very funny. I mean, I would have, if we had more time.
Does that mean they had strike pay?
They didn't have strike pay because they were unofficial. So they were out collecting on the streets. Pilkingtons, yeah. I mean, I remember Pilkingtons as well. As far as I know, there wasn't a connection. But perhaps, they were starting to move out of Leeds when the strike was called off. And so perhaps, they might have tried to make some connections. I certainly know they were going to the northeast and to the clothing factories in the northeast. So perhaps they would have tried. The only thing I can say about Pilkingtons is, having been a member of the Socialist Labour League at the time, we certainly covered the strike at Pilkingtons. And, but I'm not suggesting there were people who were workers there, but it was certainly covered in the workers' press. And I remember the breakaway union, and that it was actually, a big mistake. As far as I know, this didn't happen here. They didn't set up a breakaway. And it's also amazing, if you look at the rule book, actually, of that union, which disappeared as well into what's called the GMB now. It got swallowed up into the big unions. The rule book still calls for socialism at this point in 1970, the rule book of this union. So it's an interesting sort of contradictory thing. The Roaches had been members of the Communist Party. Whether they had left by this point, I think they had. They were colleagues, if you like, of the historian E.P. Thompson, and sort of would have seen themselves as humanitarian, I think, communists. So they had left the Communist Party. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll take another round of questions. And if you are sitting there thinking, should I ask a question, and you're not quite sure, you're feeling a bit nervous, do ask a question. We're really keen for people who don't normally speak at these kind of meetings to ask questions, so please do, if you're not quite sure, go for it. And there was a hand at the back. Great. Yeah, do you want to go?
You mentioned the decline of the textile industry.
Speak up a bit.
The decline of the industry as being a factor. Now, I know often you read comments that it was competition from cheaper labour in Asia. That was a big factor in the decline in employment in the textile industry in Britain. I don't know how you feel that could be overcome, and what might be a basis for solidarity between workers in this country and workers in Asia.
We'll take a couple more questions. We'll give you a bit of thinking time.
That's a discussion point, I would say, for others as well. That's kind of the major issue of the times.
There's a question here.
You were talking about how the press neglected to talk about it a lot, or publicise it at all. And I was just wondering what you did that come up just of blatant sexism, or was that the idea that they should just do in the kitchen is really cool, like they should just stay in the home. And I guess more generally, why they neglected to kind of embrace them, or they didn't want to embrace them, and especially why maybe the right has perhaps been more successful in embracing women in that way.
Are you talking about the press? Why the press didn't?
Yeah,
okay.
and then also the left-wing press.
Okay.
And then Marco.
Then two questions related to later disputes. 2 years later was the Mansfield hosiery strike, which was a textile strike as well, and it was mainly Asian workers involved, and the union was not supporting. And at the time, it was interpreted as kind of quite like a racist division. And there we can see there was also a division between the workers and the union. What was the composition? Were there already migrant workers involved in that strike, and did it come up as an issue? And then the second question would be about the Tricor strike, which is here in West London. car parts factory for equal pay, where most of the men of this car parts supplier that do the windscreen wipers basically escaped. I mean, they stayed inside, and it was around the equal pay demand. How kind of prevalent was the equal pay demand in that strike? Was it more like, okay, we want a similar wage increase, or was it clearly stated by the women that we should have equal pay, and was there any division with the male workers around that?
The decline of the textile industry and the competition from people being paid very, very low wages in other parts of the world, and how to overcome these divisions. I think that's something we should open up for discussion. If I had the answer to that, I would be lucky. I think it's very complicated. Obviously, the whole basis of manufacturing industry has shifted to China, to the Indian subcontinent, to other parts of the world, away from Europe, the United States even. And that competition is fierce. There are some attempts. I remember a colleague of mine who worked organizing and training for Unite, when I was training for Unite, setting up a link of communication between Ford workers in China and Ford workers here, and trying to have a dialogue. So I'm sure there are probably people working on issues like this, and that in a way would be very, very important. How can workers internationally support each other? But the old industry, yes, the old manufacturing industry of Britain at this period is going, and for all, it was the first, it was where the Industrial Revolution was, in all kinds of ways. It wasn't competing, but also, of course, it was still at this point paying decent wages, and then that all shifted. So, but I think, this is an interesting, very, very important question at the heart of everything. Why the press didn't publicize, I tried to sort of say it. I think because that industry was not at the heart, if you like, of the British manufacturing industry in the same way mines, docks, shipbuilding, steel, right, which were very male-dominated industries. So there is that issue as well, I think. So I think it's two things. But I think the fact that they didn't have a huge impact on the economy nationally would be quite important. Whereas, for instance, teachers, many of them were women, they were on strike. That gets a lot of publicity because it affects everybody. Whereas this, at this point, was still just in mostly Leeds and a little bit in the northeast. And as I say, not one of the big manufacturing industries. I think the left did embrace this strike pretty much, again, like Pilkington. Certainly, I can only speak for my version of the left, which was the workers' press, and the group around that were very, very involved. And I was at that point taking down stories on the phone in London from people ringing in about everything that was going on in the rest of the country. That was my job, sitting at a typewriter doing this. And so there was an attempt to cover that, certainly, and participate to some extent. And some of the people I did interview were people who had been supporters of that strike from left-wing groups. So there were people around a bit and trying to publicize it in the left-wing press, certainly. The point about the Mansfield hosiery strike, and the union, again, not supporting it, and migrant workers. As far as I know, that was not a major issue. Migrant workers was not a major issue in this strike. This is still, I think, pretty well at this point in Leeds, a largely white working class female workforce. And that issue, as far as I know, didn't arise. I could be wrong, but I certainly don't know. Now, again, another very funny scene from the film, which is based on reality, is the scabs turning up at the factory gates, and all the women are there, hundreds of them, picketing, and the police, and it's very, it's rough, and all the women get out their big, long shears and start doing this at the men. So, and very funny. I mean, the well-paid, the best paid, often were the scabs, and they were the men. There were no women tailors, which is why the Morning Star's description of it as a tailor's strike was so inappropriate. So the scabs were largely men. And it was about equal pay. End of story. That's what blew it up, that the skilled men got a higher rise than the skilled women. So they were saying, we want the same thing. So it was just about equal pay, definitely. And I think that the thing I quoted were from Gertie Roach about how, at this point, women they're hearing all the time about equal rights for women, equal pay for women, equality, women's liberation. This is that time, isn't it? And she's saying, of course, this is going to have an impact. People are going to start saying, hey, what about us?
Thank you. Okay, we'll take another round of questions. Okay. So we'll take one here and at the back there. Yeah, and I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask questions as well in this round. Okay, and then I'll come back to some of the others.
I just wondered, Liz, how this history, how unions currently use this history, and I don't know how, what link you've made. So you've this is specifically in Leeds, but this is a very prime example, it seems to me, of women leading and the unions not quite being so helpful in that. And so I'm interested in really the lessons learned and how this history can be used to inform now.
Can I ask you about the kind of what you see as the preconditions for the strike commission? You talked a lot about rank and file militancy and kind of resistance from union leadership. And I was just wondering why did women? What were the conditions that led them to come out on strike at that period? Were there signs of previous action before?
And I had a question, which was, so you talked about Gertie Roach in the sense of a kind of wave of equal rights, and this is coming, and people are going to have to, things are going to move and change. So you talked about equal pay as a demand of the strike, and I just wondered if there were other challenges going on in the workplace on the basis of gender around maybe things like the types of work that people did, or anything else around kind of how people worked alongside each other on a gendered basis.
Right. How the unions use this history currently? Not enough, is what I would say. I think trade union education can be very, very hidebound, very backward-looking, very formal. When I was working for Unite, the union, we certainly were really working hard to bring this history right into the middle of trade union education. And it was very flexible, that particular time and that particular group of, Unite officers. But you would certainly run into others who would not really want to use this history effectively and be scared of it. So I would guess it's patchy, and it will very much depend on individuals and how they pick it up and run with it, or whether they're allowed to, actually, sadly. So it's not great answer, but and I don't know about a lot of other unions, of course. I wouldn't know. I kind of know about Unison and Unite, the two unions I would be most aware of. And of course what everybody did was set up women's committees and women's conferences and that. But that still is very controlled, in my opinion, and controlling. And it's sort of diffused a lot of this energy in a funny way. Though I would never be against it, it's somehow also kind of said, okay, now we've done it. We've brought in these structures. We don't have to do anything else, Preconditions for the strike. Well, the working conditions were terrible, for starters. I've seen film of the factories, thousands of people, incredible noise, dust, etc., all that. And I think there were all kinds of ways that people tried to subvert that. And, you tried to find little corners within all that work. So working conditions are terrible. They had strikes earlier, but not so big, and not so, didn't go on for so long. So they weren't completely inexperienced. There have been some even in the 1920s in the clothing industry, in particular factories. But the thing that really did it was this union agreement that gave less to skilled women than skilled men. And that's what finally did it. And it did come on the top of the 1968 Ford strike and the equal pay legislation, which was passed, but of course was in 1970, but wasn't enacted until 1975, thereby giving the employers plenty of time to either get rid of all the women or somehow fiddle about and get away with murder. So the 68 strike had happened, and I'm sure obviously these women would have known about that too, and would have known about this legislation, but it wasn't there yet, it wasn't enacted yet. So it was equal pay. Yes, equal rights, equal pay, etc., and other issues. I think it was one of those incredibly divided workforces, where the cutters, the tailors, were all men, basically, and women did some sort of semi-skilled but less well-paid jobs. And I think probably you had foremen who were men, supervisors who were men, and the women who were workers, for sure. And I'm sure there were issues. Again, I don't know, but I can imagine in that given situation there must have been harassment issues and all kinds of other issues. But I couldn't say. I just can't imagine there weren't. And those kind of power struggles, if you like, and gender imbalance. There must have been. And certainly, as implied, well, not just implied, as in some of the quotes I gave, people knew that the women who were on strike were also getting a bad time at home. They were not having an easy time, a lot of them. They were having to come home and do everything again and put up with a fair bit of stick about why you're doing this, And not everywhere, of course, but there would have been that going on too, I'm sure. And it seemed that was, out of line.
Thank you. I saw some more hands. Great. So, if you want to go first, and then Mike, and then behind. Yeah. Okay.
You said it was a strike for equal pay, but even the achievement of the extra shillings wouldn't have brought the women up to the men's rates.
It just about did.
Did it?
Yeah. Okay. With what they were offered first, and then they got offered a bigger increase on the second round, it adds up. Again, just among a certain group of workers, though.
But I was going to say, at the time, the trade union bureaucracy paid a great deal of attention to differentials.
Yes.
It was it was a way of forming a mini aristocracy, really. Mostly of men, of course, who justified better pay on the grounds that they were more, that there was more skill content in the work, and this was generally accepted across a big swathe of industry. It was the same in the car industry. It's the breakup of this paternalist ideology is quite important.
I'd like to know where are they now, as in these women who took part in this revolution. Do we know anything about how they experienced the gains of the revolution and the losses of the counter-revolution? The obvious answer to where they are now is they're probably the pensioners, but after this, there's been a massive transformation in their lives. Do we know anything about how they experienced it?
What would be interesting to know is, when you were doing the research, did you get an insight into the opinions of these women's husbands and partners, and did you get a general sense of support coming from them, or was it more of a kind of sexist mindset, stay out of trouble, just do your job, be in your place?
Okay. Yes, the trade union bureaucracy paying a lot of attention to these differentials and fighting very hard to keep them in many, many industries.
With the support of many of the men.
Absolutely, totally. And it's kind of I think it's the engineering workers union doesn't even let women in until the 1960s. I mean, it's extraordinary how long this continues in this tradition. So, yes, I agree. It's called dilution too, isn't it? Sort of this phrase, dilution, which means you want to keep your highly skilled, best paid people. And as you say, they tend to be men in most of these industries. Where are they now? I don't know. I mean, we're talking 40-something years ago, so the people I spoke to were quite elderly. So, and they went on, they stayed in the industry. An awful lot of them stayed in the industry, but it was contracting. And now there's none of it at all. There were just a few empty factories. So they went on to do other jobs, cleaning jobs, cooking jobs, jobs like that. But I think, again, of the few strikers I could talk to, they did feel it was a transforming experience for them personally. Even if, in the end, they didn't save the factories and the rest of it. They felt for themselves, like Sylvia had quoted at the end, that the importance of acting. You don't expect somebody else to do something for you. You get out there and you do it yourself if you want something done. And that was, I think, a lesson. If you had to take something positive from it, that's what I felt. That was the lesson that people took from that, and that was important for people who had never participated in anything like this before and challenged, genders and all the rest of it at home and at work. So it was a big fight. Husbands and partners views, good one. I don't know. I never found any husbands and partners to talk to. They were mostly gone already, sadly. They tend to die first, and without putting it. That's the way it goes. And so it was. I didn't find any. I know from Roy Battersby, who spoke to a lot of people in 1974, that some of the women had a really hard time, as I was saying to Alice, at home. Not all, of course, not all. There would be some who would be very supportive, men who would be very supportive, but equally there would be a number who weren't, and who were very upset by this and saw this as something. And this has happened before. This has often happened when women have taken action like this. They've had to fight on all fronts. And that, I think, is what the experience of many of them would have been.
Thank you. Take another round of questions. Kieran. 3. Yeah, go on, Kieran.
Yeah, I just had a contribution to make. The woman in front of me, sorry, I don't know your name, about how the unions have used this. So I'm a GMB rep, and my factory, it's a food factory, and it's mainly women who work there, and mainly Gujarati women. And our branch was the branch that was around at the time that the Bromwich strike was happening, and actually Jai Ben Desai was in that branch. So the branch kind of, it's like this kind of gift that you've got this kind of Gujarati woman leading the Bromwich strike as a kind of reference point for like my factory and a lot of the factories in that area. So one of the things I did was organise a meeting specifically for women, like kind of using the image of her. Loads of women in my factory didn't even know who she was. So it was like, okay, like come and you'll find out who she is, and then hopefully kind of get more women involved in the union, because it's very male dominated. So the intention was there, but the problem was no bloody women came. And there was like 2, but it was mainly like men that came still. So the problem is still there that you mentioned, like all of this is very familiar stuff, like you feel like the union is not really there for you, even though you were the majority of the workforce. You just see a lot of kind of male men in leadership roles. It's not to say that women aren't reps, but the people who kind of speak and just feel kind of confident to take on that role is like, it's massively frustrating that the situation you describe not everywhere, but my experience has been that it's still there. And that's just a kind of comment of frustration, I guess. How do you kind of get beyond this barrier of the mind,
There's a couple of comments which might include some questions, but the exuberance of that march is amazing. And I remember, because in part I remember the film on the television, but I don't remember the strike. I don't know. I was on strike from the post office, 6.5 weeks, and where I'm from, Reading, there was 1,001 postmen, pretty well all men. One person went in for mass strikes or mass pickets on the sorting office and all the smaller offices and so on. And we all went to a trade union hall afterwards. Everyone enjoyed it, you know. And then there were some women came in who were weeping, and they were telephone operators. And a lot of their colleagues had gone into work, and a lot of them had been driven there by their husbands. I mean, not driven with a whip, I mean, they were behind the wheel of the car. And the husbands and the scabs going in were having a go at the women who were picketing. The next day, they thought there's only one scab gone into the post office, so we'll go and picket the telephone exchanges. So there were hundreds of us. And the women who were with us said that the light was on in the front window. That was a sick room. I reckon that a lot of weeping women inside were going up there. All through the strike, it was originally planned to have a meeting, a mass meeting once a week, but we decided to have it every day because it enjoyed so much. And there was singing, there was poetry, there were speeches, and I say the exuberance, and on the picket line as well. Everybody enjoyed it. However, not long afterwards, I was working in London and walking off a building site, and I heard a couple of blokes behind me. And one of them were talking about women working. Said, "Oh, they're only in it for the pin money." So that was a common attitude at the time. On the world scale, and the thing is, of course, the left is very weak, pretty well everywhere, organised left. And I do remember seeing a thing not long ago saying that there are now more working class people in South Korea than there were in the whole world when Marx and Engels were. So the forces are there. And again, on the narrowness of the leadership, and having now, like many people, joined the Labour Party to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, they talk about procedure all the time. Motions get thrown out because they're not procedurally right. They're talking about canvassing, and they're not interested in global warming, plastic, species extinctions, all the rest of it, all the stuff. There's so much in there. But I think the forces are there, and I think the hope is there as well.
Yeah, a couple of points. First one, question. You mentioned a couple of times, Liz, that they met in the Trades Council's premises, and I wondered what sort of support there was from trade unionists in other industries. And you said that because they didn't get strike pay, they were collecting, and I wondered if they got, if you managed to find out whether they got money from other workplaces and so on, which is quite common in that sort of situation. Two quick comments. Just sorry, I have to respond to the last comment that Labour Party members aren't interested in discussing global warming or strikes and so on. It's just not true. That whole atmosphere has changed. If you look at the work being done by Labour Party members around the Ritzy strikes, for instance. But I want to come in on this question of the trade unions and their history, and I was going to say this before somebody else mentioned Grumwicks. As Trades Council locally in the area where the Grumwick strike was, we were doing stuff last year for the 40th anniversary of the exhibition in Rivalry and so on and so forth. And that was very much a warts and all history. The GMB, which is a successor union, also did stuff for the 40th anniversary. And that, if you look at it, is actually quite a sanitised history, because there are all sorts of issues. Grumwick was mixed in terms of the official trade unions, with a lot of support, but also a lot of undermining at the same time. So, and unions tend to sanitise that. And one fascinating thing was I went to one meeting that GMB organised about the 40th anniversary, and the GMB regional officials speaking about it obviously thought that the government at the time that used the Special Patrol Group and so on against the strikers and the pickets was a Tory government. It wasn't. It was a Labour government.
Okay, I think the only question there was about whether they collected other workplaces. Yes, they had started to do that, to get out of Leeds and out into the surrounding countryside, but they had only just started to do that. Really, this was new to them, you know. So, but they did a lot of street collections. They did very well. I mean, the whole town was supporting them, you know. So, I don't think there was anything else that was a question.
So it seems like maybe we might move into more open discussion now. Before we do so, is there anyone who has got a burning question that they would like to ask Liz? Okay, so we've got about another half an hour, so we can, yeah. So I'll continue to take a stack of hands for the discussion, but we'll have a more open discussion now and not so much of a back and forth necessarily. So any comments or contributions that people would like to make? Go on.
Okay, yeah, just I suppose a kind of, just a sort of, perhaps a mild criticism of your little potted history of the 1970s.
Yeah.
Not a serious denunciation.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear it.
Because I think one thing you could have mentioned, of course, was the whole thing of the social contract.
Yes.
Or the social contract, as workers at the time called it, you know, which for the benefit of young people who don't remember anything about this, you know, this was a kind of an agreement between the government and the trade union leadership to basically suppress workers' struggles and to try and to try and restrict, in the name of fighting inflation, it was effectively to try and to ensure that wages went up less quickly than prices did. And the point is that this was it was initially successful. They really did manage to hold back workers' wages, but then everything just sort of exploded and workers wouldn't have it anymore, and you know, the car workers were some of the first people to really smash the social contract. And you know, and of course ultimately, as you know, people in the party will tell you, with some embarrassment, this is partly what led to the election of Thatcher, because the Labour government was totally discredited and, you know, effectively totally opposed by the working class.
It was great. I just want to make a comment comparing what you've said this week with Torab 2 weeks ago or something. And one of the key issues I thought in Torab's talk was about the women's struggle and how that was remarkably successful for a while, and then it kind of subsided, and one of the factors was the left, who I think were fairly male, not entirely, but they had these priorities that didn't include women, and then of course they were defeated. It seems to me that there's a similar problem here. We can talk about revolution, and yet we've got a deeply divided working class, and I think, as some people have pointed out, it's not just about pay. I don't think the women could be taped, could they? I'm not sure. But I mean, the places where I've worked in the 70s, you could tell, and you could see the women. They were all in one place.
Yeah.
You know, that's what they were doing, and they weren't there because they were women. It's because of the work that women had to do, and then the skilled men were off somewhere else doing the machines or something, which only involves pressing a button, really. So anyway, I'm just drawing out what I think is a comparison between two forms of defeat, and I think the relationship between men and women is rather important, I suspect, to that defeat. It's a general comment. Sorry, I was addressing it to you because I love the talk.
Thank you very much. And I didn't take it personally, you're right.
I'm just going to pass around a sign-up sheet if anyone wants to find out more about what's coming up in this series, so I will just pass that round.
Yeah.
And yeah, just indicate if you want to speak. I've just given my pen away actually, which was probably a bad idea, because now I can't make notes about computer. We'll try. I think I might have another one. Yeah, so Simon, and then yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a great talk, and it's just to draw a comparison between the sort of problems that you've talked about with this clothing strike and what's, in my mind, in the sense of the immediate, which is the movement in France. And what strikes me is that we look back on the history of trade unionism and the gains that trade unionism achieved for the working class in the post-war boom, and then these situations where the trade union bureaucracy, and you mentioned the incredible statistic about unofficial strikes, which I had forgotten, is absolutely unbelievable that most of these strikes are unofficial. This is in the early 70s. But what we have now, it seems to me, is people revolting, as they did in France, without any of that social democratic and trade union, or with very little of that social democratic and trade union structure in the way between those people and the ruling class. I don't want to say, I'm aware there's been looking at things about the kind of very, that movement is very heterogeneous. There's a lot of different things going on. There's some outright really reactionary stuff going on in there. So it's a very mixed up movement. But compared to this, there just isn't that thing that, it's a workplace movement, and then you've got this trade union and Labour Party stuff in the middle, and then you've got the sort of enemy there. That is not the dynamic. It's a different dynamic, and I think we've seen it's very dramatic, and then retreat by the government in France and so on. So I think that, along with what people were saying about globalization, the fact that all these industries have moved out, you've got this huge working class in South Korea or China. These are the countries outside of Europe. Those are two sides of what has changed since then. This is a conflict.
Just to quickly supplement the previous speaker about the 70s, I know there's a few people here who will remember the time, but for those who wouldn't and perhaps haven't really looked at it, this question of inflation and the social contract, you had the oil price shock of 73 and another oil price shock of 79, and inflation was, as it were, going through the roof. So 5p was nothing, was it, in that period? And so if prices were going up by, say, 20%, then a 15% pay rise just was not adequate. And that is what caused a large wave of strikes and so-called winter discontent.
Sorry, the person next to Simon. Did you have your hand up?
It was just a quick question. The email list that's going around, if we're already on this year's list and last year's list, we don't need to add our names to this as well, do we? Thank you.
Okay.
No, just a quick comment to what Simon said. If we look at the movement in France, we see a lot of crossovers between, let's say, the more organized sector of the working class and these yellow vests. You've got Renault workers who went out because of the pension kind of thing. You had the Amazon workers near Marseille. They were blocking their warehouse for 4 or 5 days. Internal struggle about, like, a lot of them are courier drivers as well, so they were affected by it was basically a wage cut for them, the tax. But with the help of these yellow vests, they blockaded the warehouse. Refinery workers and dock workers. So, like, I think these crossovers are extremely important if we think about the rather dubious kind of internal dynamics within that movement, meaning like the far right and let's say more middle class kind of tendencies. It's quite important that these kind of crossovers happen. The question is, like, what happens when these yellow vests and their more spontaneous forms of organizing themselves come together with, these organized sectors? Is something positive coming out of that,
I just wanted to say that there are two things really. If it's actions like this that produced the Industrial Relations Act, the unsuccessful attempt by the Heath government to impose restraints on the trade unions, and eventually, of course, 10 years down the line, brought the Thatcher government's much more concentrated on the trade unions. But this is also the point at which the Tories decided they ought to join the common market.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Which had a contemporary ring to it,
Yes,
doesn't it?
it does indeed, yes.
Going to take about 3 or 4 more contributions, so do please indicate if you'd like to speak, particularly if you haven't already asked a question or contributed tonight. Yeah, so I'll take Mark next, and then...
This is more kind of a sort of an announcement, I guess, than a contribution, but maybe it is a contribution as well. Just to say this, we have this room tonight. I don't know whether it was mentioned at the beginning on behalf of the Radical Anthropology Group. This is an anthropology building, so and the reason they were particularly keen to help us host it is because they're into, especially women's role in various societies of non-capitalist societies, certainly hunter-gatherer societies in the past. I mean, just on Tuesday we were watching, and on several Tuesdays in a row now, we were discussing, talking about hunter-gatherers in the Congo, and although there are many differences between the way in which pygmy hunter-gatherers live in small communities in the Congo today and the way in which people were living in Leeds in the 1970s, to say the least, in the declining capitalism. There are some weird, uncanny similar. I mean, you know, it's pity I can't show you the imagery of women coming together collectively in those communities and utterly intimidating the men, and coming together, singing together, and creating a society which seems to have lasted for tens and tens of thousands of years. I mean, this is slightly controversial, but not that. There's a lot of genetic and other cultural evidence that the way in which these communities, these hunter-gatherers, still live in the Congo, in small communities, it's very similar to the way they might have been living, you know, tens and tens of thousands of years ago. So this, obviously, those who know their Engels and other things will sort of go back to those connections. So anyway, the point I'm really making is if you want to stretch your historical brain beyond sort of that sort of area of history, consider coming to the Radical Anthropology Group, which is based in this room, in this building now, every Tuesday evening. If you check out the Radical Anthropology Group website, the whole series, we haven't got the flyers for it yet, for next term will be on their website next week or wherever. So thank you.
Great, I think I've seen 2 more hands, and then we'll come back to Liz to wrap up at the end. So.
I was wondering what the age range was of the women on strike.
I would imagine 18 to 60. I think the whole spectrum, from photographs and from discussions. I think so. Some young people, but probably a lot of the majority were probably in their 30s and 40s. But some older people were there too, because you could work till 65 at that point. 60 rather. You could retire at 60 and get a pension. some good things about being older. We get to quit.
Wait here.
Can we watch the film online?
Oh, I've been asked that before, and I don't think so. I shouldn't even have this. I mean, try. It's the BBC's, But try. It's worth a try. It's worth a try because it has been raised. It appears sometimes, from time to time, in film festivals and things about that era and Wednesday plays. But give it a go. I must admit, I haven't tried recently, and somebody might have actually successfully put it online. So it's worth trying, and it is worth watching.
It looks like it.
Yeah, it is worth watching.
If you put stuff up on Vimeo, it sometimes just stays. If the BBC don't care, because it's a real film, it will just stay. So anyone who has technology borrows your DVD, put it up on Vimeo, and it probably will stay.
No, well, okay, we can tell you.
Oh, yeah, you can tell me what to do. Because I've got the whole thing, obviously.
Just a very brief point of information, I guess. We are in anthropology department of UCL, which is part of the University of London. and there is a boycott of several University of London venues happening now around a dispute of various outsourced workers, so cleaners, receptionists, maintenance workers, etc., to try to get brought in-house and get better conditions and more rights and so on. So this has been won in most of University of London already because of previous actions, but various parts are still holding out. So if people want to know details of that, there's a website, just boycottsenatehouse.co.uk. Boycott Senate House, you'll find it. And that's, well, the IWGB union are helping to organise that. So parts of Senate House, the Institute of Historical Research, various other places. So just be aware of where it's being boycotted.
Okay, so I think we'll come back to Liz to wrap up.
Well, I don't know if it's, it's a few comments, I think. In thinking back over this period and doing this, it's extraordinary. There was an election in 64, there's an election in 66, there's an election in 70, there's an election in 74, and then 79. If you think since then, these long periods of one prime minister, at that point it was very tumultuous. And I come back to where I started. It seemed to some of us, the whole thing was shaking. They made a lot of attempts, like the social contract, in place of strife, which failed as well. The attempt by the Labour government to mediate and control things. Tories passed the Industrial Relations Act, then it gets repealed, then the social and it really, through the 60s and 70s, it was a very, very uncertain, lively time here. And so when I look back on it now, and I was young then, it did seem, everything was possible. It seemed like that. And so that's why, in a sense, I felt that this talk fits into the range of the whole talk. So I hope it's been useful to people. And thanks for coming.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks to everyone for coming along and contributing, and especially thanks to Liz for a fantastic talk. Simon is gesticulating at me, so I think he has something to say.
Two announcements. The first is I've printed out a lot of leaflets telling people about the rest of this series. We've got 8 talks, which I think will be no less super than the one we've heard this evening. Starting on Thursday, the 31st of January, She's Leaving Home, Women's 60s Renaissance, which is Lynn Segal, who was there in the 60s. China and the Cultural Revolution is in February. That's with Steve Smith, who came and spoke in the Russia series. Then Revolutionary Protest in the Vietnam War era, and a talk on the women's movement in Italy. Those are both in March. Anyway, it's all on this leaflet, which is on the corner of that table. We're also going to put on the corner of that table, in case somebody missed out and wanted to donate, there's the plastic Tupperware thing with money in it, so you may donate. Okay, that's the first announcement about this series. The second announcement is about Russia. Our first series in 2017 was about Russia, the Russian Revolution, and it was a great success. So I'm saying this because I think a lot of people here may be interested. The struggle continues in Russia in a very different form now, and on Saturday, the 19th of January, anti-fascists in Russia will mark, as they've marked every year for the last 10 years, the shooting of 2 anti-fascist activists, Stanislav Markelov and Anastasia Baburova, in broad daylight in the middle of Moscow, by a fascist group, which was later, they found the guys who did it and put them in jail, and they had very close links with the Kremlin. And every year since, our comrades and fellow thinkers in Russia, Ukraine, have gone out on the streets and demonstrated in increasingly difficult circumstances over the last 10 years. Now, this is the 10th anniversary, so the London Anti-Fascists and Plan C and some other organisations are going to demonstrate in the East End on that day. We've met and decided we're not going to go to the Russian embassy, which is in Kensington. We're not interested in speaking to the shoppers in Kensington or to the embassy staff, who won't be there anyway because it's a Saturday. So we're going to go to the East End. We're going to be at the Cable Street mural, and we're going to march to Alta Valley Park and really situate the solidarity with our comrades in Russia in the the new kind of anti-fascist movement which we now see is emerging against the sort of recent upsurge of fascist activity that we've seen. And what's happening in Russia at the moment is that there are 11 anti-fascists from St. Petersburg and a much smaller town called Penza who've been arrested and are due to go on trial in this network case, which is just fabricated beyond belief by the security services. And what stands out to me about this case is that they've arrested these people and tortured them with electric shocks and all the rest of it, medieval stuff. Usually when they do that, they try and kind of keep the people inside and get them to shut up. I mean, they're so brazen. They have allowed these people's stories to get out. You can read this on the internet, and it's very open. They're openly sort of terrorizing people. So we want to express solidarity. We're working with the defense committee that's been set up by the parents of these 11 people and their friends in Russia. So it's Saturday the 19th of January. We've also just launched a big money appeal. They need legal support. Their parents have to go and visit them. They keep people in detention. They don't do it up the road. There's one guy who's just been in detention a year and had his pre-trial detention renewed. So, really important occasion. Tom is going to give out leaflets about that as you go out, if you haven't got one, and there's stuff on the internet, Facebook, Solidarity with Russian Anti-Fascists, you'll find it, and there's an address on the leaflet as well. So,
are we going to the Tavistock Hotel, or where are we going?
I think Alice will.
Are there any other announcements people want to make before I make the very important announcement of which pub we're going to?
Just for people who live close to Twickenham. No, we've got a ticket at McDonald's in Twickenham Sunday 5:30 for Uber Eats couriers. So if anyone is in the West London area, Twickenham area, just speak to me after this. Thanks.
Before the most important announcement of the night, which is where we go to afterwards, if a couple of people would stay behind a bit just to sort out the chairs, because we need to get the room back in the same state we left it in. So basically half the chairs need to go piled up. I'll tell you when you stay.
Okay, and so to close, the very important announcement of where we are going for a drink. So I think the committee has decided that we will go to the bar of the Tavistock Hotel, which is on Tavistock Street, just south of here.
On Tavistock Square.
Tavistock Square, there we go, sorry. Thank you.
Come out here and turn right and walk down about a block, and then it's in front of you more or less.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Okay, most of the chairs are comfortable on the side, and we put the tables in a square with chairs about. I mean,
I haven't got a video account. All I know is I did it years ago, and I managed to do it. So even if I could do it, almost anyone can do it. And I think the BBC don't care. They'll just leave it up there. Whereas it wasn't so. I think someone needs to grab it. Not me, because I don't do it. Just put it up.
You've got the film on the TV.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Is that your own?
No, but there's a bit of a fault. Whoever put it from the video to something in the middle.
Oh, what? Yeah, just paid.
Yes, that's what it's on. And he's put it onto this, and he's not got it. It's a bit rough. Something
So what happened?
Oh, it goes slowly. First, and then it comes back.
Oh. Lose a chunk of film.
Let me look at the whole thing again. Because presumably Simon knows how to get in touch with you.
So, I was going to say, could I actually borrow?
You can borrow it. I was thinking have a look and check it out because I can look at it all together.
My marks
And make sure he's happy about it. You know what I mean? I'm sure he will, but just on the and so I thought, like, would you give me your phone number or something, and then we can sort it out. But I better just make sure that that's okay. I'm sure that that's great. There's a lot of so don't do anything until I yes, so you can see what's wrong somewhere. I can't remember the problem, but there is
You're right.